Welcome to Therapist Uncensored, a podcast where therapists freely speak their minds about real-life matters.
Hey everybody, welcome back. In today's episode, we are picking up on the second half of the conversation with Doug Braun-Harvey. Doug is based in San Diego, and he, along with co-author Michael Vigorito, have published a very fun book, actually. It's called Treating Out of Control Sexual Behavior, Rethinking Sex Addiction. It's a way of talking about sexuality with pleasure and vitality and fun and passion. And really, Doug has been instrumental in changing the conversation nationally and even been behind some laws that have been changed in the area of sexual health. It's a combination of mental health and sexuality, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. So again, this is the second episode. If you've missed the first one, then just scroll up or down on your player and you'll see it. It's the one right next to it, right before it. But certainly if you want to, just go ahead and dive in, and it's self-contained, but it'll still be fun, believe me. You probably will still want to go back and listen to the first one, but all right, let's dive right in.
Now, the dilemma with desire discrepancy is it moves too quickly to focus on frequency.
Yes.
I think desire, it gets confused. Frequency of sex is a different issue than desire. So one of the things I was going to say about desire is one thing a couple can experiment with is if you don't feel desirous of sex, we know people can get sexually excited if they just start having sex. So people think if they don't feel desire, they shouldn't move towards sex. But actually, many people start feeling sexually desirous after they start having sex. So have you experimented with that? Have you tried that? Give it a shot and say, all right, I'll be willing to start having sex and then see what happens.
And to keep it to the context also of the exploitation, understanding, even just in that frame, understanding unequal sexual desire and how one dialogues about it, because sometimes we trip over it and we end up being somewhat exploitive or exploited because of fear of having that dialogue.
Yes.
And so somebody feeling injured or hurt because they feel not desired by their partner because their partner's not getting an erection.
They take
with
it
them.
personally.
And so then they get hurt. And so then you may be tempted to engage in sexuality in a way in order. So the exploitation concept can be part of it, where an open dialogue about that desire could really help from.
So, Anne, I'm going to translate open dialogue to a sexual health principle.
Okay.
And that's the honesty.
Yes.
Sexual health principle. So what we're really talking about now is how difficult it is to be honest about these experiences we have about sex, how much we desire it, what we like, what we don't like. These are difficult things for some people to be honest about. And for sometimes people don't even know how to be honest about it because they don't know what they like. And one of the primary reasons people don't know what they like is their relationship with masturbation. So if you're interested in how somebody maybe doesn't know themselves sexually very well, ask them how frequently they masturbate. And we know there's a pretty good correlation between people who don't understand their body's responses and have anti-masturbation attitudes. The way we learn about our body is through by being with our body. And if there's judgments or values about being with one's body by themselves and having pleasure as not acceptable, they'll probably be less literate and aware of their body.
So one of the principles that really helps with the two when we're talking about consent and non-exploitation, the other one is honesty. So
yes.
These principles actually really integrate with one another when you really hold them. So the idea of really learning authenticity and honesty
yep.
that's part of the six principles that you mentioned that they can
So I want to give one quick parenting tip about honesty. It's just real quick. That parents, one of the most common places you get questions about sex is driving the car, all these different, you're never ready for it, right? Somebody just all of a sudden asks a question out of the blue and a parent's like, what do I say? When a parent freezes and is kind of scared about any particular sex question, here's where you can institute one of the sexual health principles by using honesty. You just take a little breath, calm yourself down, because then we know if we take a breath, our brain slows down. Take a breath. Say, I really appreciate you being honest with me about that. And you just construct some sentence that does two things. You're grateful to your child for asking you, and you're glad they were honest with you. However you want to say it, figure out a way to say that. Make that a way to reinforce to your children you welcome their curiosity being brought to you, and you like that they're being honest about not knowing something about sex. If they learn that as a child, they'll learn how to do it with their partner. years later, decades later, they'll
keep asking you questions.
That's right. They're going to keep asking questions. So there'll be a better sex. You're really making your child a better sex partner 30 years from now by just practicing that tiny little 10-second moment.
Instead of, where did you hear that?
That's right. And the people couldn't see that.
Saying that
when
to
Anne
you?
said that, she had a big scowl on her face. And I was like, of course, we know, I know from doing sex histories with adults, oftentimes what adults remember about sex conversations with their parents is not so much the words. They remember the facial expression their parent had when they talked about it.
That's so true.
Can we grab one more probably before we're going to have to wrap up?
Well, we have to talk about pleasure.
And so how about let's throw into shared values and pleasure. How about
shared values and pleasure? Well, shared values really is, all that really means is human beings, when we have sex versus other mammals, when we have sex, sex has meaning to us. Meaning we have brains that reflect and contemplate the existential meaning of having sexual interactions with another person.
Unlike the bonobos.
Right, unlike the bonobos. That's right. The bonobos, if you're not aware, are an ape community that has enormous amounts of sexual activity. And what's interesting is they're the least violent apes on the planet. Right. And they have sex with all sorts of people all the time. They're members of their community. So that's where that comes from. But so shared values is really about making sure we understand the meaning of sex. We'll teach adolescents these 6 sexual health principles. A lot of therapists might have them in their waiting room or have them in their wall. They're just hanging on a wall, and kids look up, what's that? And they're kind of complaining. And it's an opportunity for a conversation. You don't start talking about this with youth. You just put the words somewhere and let them ask. They may be going through it and say, well, shared values. And one adolescent in particular was very proud about, I've got that shared values down. I know exactly what that is. And the therapist was very happy about this. Oh, geez, how do you understand shared values so confidently? He said, no problem. We go to the same church. So there was this shorthand that because we have the same religion, we have all the same values when it comes to sex, and we don't even need to talk about it because our church tells us what our values are. And so why do we need to talk about values? We know what they are, and because we go to the same church every Sunday, we have all the same values. And so it's a way to avoid the conversation by finding shorthand, avoidant ways to talk about values, which are really difficult conversations for many people to have. So shared values is really just more about the meaning of sex and making sure, if you're going to have sex with me, is it because you love me, or is it because you're interested in having an orgasm with me, or is it because the boys want to see if you can, have me, or the girls said, you could never get the most handsome guy in school, so there I did. And, what's the motive? What's the value here?
And understanding it's really important for you to understand your own value, to know whether you have a shared value, whether that's I have a value for monogamy, or a value for openness,
right,
or a value for different types of sexuality,
right,
and acts,
or values of I like to have sex with a whole range of people who express their genders in a variety of ways. That the actual anatomy of the genitals of a person is far less important to me than how I feel with the person. How the person identifies their gender is maybe not that important to me. The person may go by they, and there's not even a he or she. And I might find myself very open and interested in being with somebody who lives their life in this way. And gosh, I never imagined myself capable of this. And these are all new ideas that we have to kind of constantly be aware of. That this is something that I could find meaningful and important to me. And of course, the last one is pleasure. The idea, I'll just say 2 things about pleasure. The most current definition of sexual health by the U.S. federal government is actually from the Department of STDs and HIV. It's a subgroup of the federal government. They came up with a definition of sexual health in 2011. And much like the World Health Organization definition I read to you, very similar, except the U.S. government took the word pleasure out of the definition of sexual health.
Of course we did.
This is the most, 2011, this is the most current definition of sexual health by a federal agency of the United States government, and it does not say the word pleasure in it. So I can't use the most current definition of sexual health by our federal government because it isn't about balancing pleasure with safety.
Mm-hmm. We could say so much about that.
Yeah, you're right. So I'll just leave with a story about pleasure. True story. When you're the sexual health guy in the family, all your family members give you all these great stories they know. Mm-hmm. So my niece gave me this story. A neighbor came over to her house, and the neighbor had a 6-year-old daughter. And the mother was really wanting to be a good mom and not shame her daughter about sexuality. And so, and of course she came to my niece because my niece has this uncle. And so, they come over and talk to her because she gets information from me. It's that how it works. So anyways, they came over and had this conversation, and the mother told her this story. She said, my 6-year-old, now she didn't use this language. I'm going to now use my sexual health language for the rest of the story. This is not how the mother told the story. But this mother, her 6-year-old daughter, discovered her clitoris. Now, what's so interesting about discovering the clitoris, it's the only part of the human body, male or female, of any form of human body, that body part has only one function, and it's for pleasure. There is no other reason for the clitoris to exist in the human body other than for the body to feel pleasure. So when a girl or somebody with a clitoris discovers their clitoris, it's kind of interesting because it's like, is this all it does? And when a 6-year-old discovers their clitoris, they don't have the brain operations to generalize that this works here and it'll also work at school. They can't do that till they're 8 with abstract operations. So it has to work in the living room, and then let's see if it works in the kitchen, because they can't generalize that. So that's why 6-year-olds are discovering their clitoris in all sorts of places, because they don't realize it'll work wherever they go. They have to see if it works wherever they go. So the 6-year-old's seen if it works in the car seat, and she's seen if it works in grandma's house, and she's seen if it works in the cereal aisle. And every time she's seen if her clitoris works, her mother's being very kind and non-shaming and says, honey, remember what I told you? You need to do that in private. It's okay to touch yourself there, but you need to do that in private. And so that was her thing, all about privacy, good boundaries, right? Very good. Well, this goes on for several weeks, and I'm sure any parent out there that's been a parent of a 6-year-old knows one correction does not change behavior. So this went on for several weeks. Well, after a couple of weeks, they're in the kitchen. Mother looks down, and the daughter's seeing if her clitoris works in the kitchen. and she starts this, speech that the 6-year-old is very familiar with right now. Well, the 6-year-old is done with this talk. She's had it now with mom. So she looks up at her mother, puts her hands on her hips, looks up at her mother and says, Mom, if you just tried it once, you'd know how good it feels. Mom left out the pleasure. Yes. Mom didn't tell her, honey, I know that feels really good, but you need to do it in private. So if you don't let children know, sex feels really good.
And that it's okay that it feels
and
good.
That it's actually supposed to feel good, and it's wonderful that it feels good. If you leave that out, you look like an ignorant sex educator to a 6-year-old.
That makes a lot of sense.
They know that it feels good. They just don't know you know.
Well, you're saying, too, just to kind of wrap the pleasure into the rest of the dialogue we've been having, one is that to have a healthy desire around pleasure with yourself, and to acknowledge it inside yourself, that pleasure is not just a shameful, selfish act, but it's part of what helps us engage in the world. The bobos maybe have something there, but that to incorporate the concept of pleasure in the dialogue around sexuality with your adolescent, with your partner, and in the context of the other principles that you're talking about. So even if you're talking about in let's just say a committed relationship, and you're talking about what makes you feel pleasurable, being aware that you can talk about it as a sexual desire and a wanting without it only representing. I think we make a mistake sometimes when in couples talking about desire being about the other person. If I have desire or I don't have desire, it has to do about whether I'm attracted to you or not attracted to you.
Yes.
And so it's really hard for us to separate that and go, you have pleasurable experiences, has something to do with yourself and nothing to do with the other person, whether it's in your mind, because our mind is a very rich, and we don't allow that in the dialogue enough. Like what goes on in your mind that actually brings pleasure to you, and then sharing it with your partner. It's not just a cause-effect relationship.
Yeah, it's not just physiology.
And that allows, if we bring in the idea of even the authenticity hurting but not being exploitive, I feel pleasure about these other ideas, and being able to hear that without then shaming your partner and say, God, I have a different reaction about that. That doesn't feel pleasurable to me, and it feels pleasurable to you. Can we engage about that rather than you're disgusting because you think that.
Right.
Like what brings us pleasure is very different. And the more we're able to dialogue and engage in it, we even open it up in ourselves. Maybe your partner's brought something that sounds pleasurable to them, and your first reaction is, ugh. But maybe if you explore that, maybe you stay in that uck for you, or maybe you realize it's about cultural assumptions that you've been putting on yourself.
Yeah.
And so what I hear you saying, Doug, the sexual health aspect that makes this conversation sexy is that we're encouraging conversations like that, not just about how to avoid STDs. We're really part of a movement that wants to encourage a dialogue about what is pleasurable to you, what is pleasurable to the people that you're sexually involved with or want to be, and engage in an equal dialogue around that we have differences in those things and that those differences can be okay. And maybe they're not acceptable to you, but that's okay. Then that's an equal dialogue to say, maybe we do split here because what you desire and what I desire is so different. But we can do that without creating pressure or shame that engages a whole nother realm that makes sex not safe in a relationship.
If somebody's really interested in what you just said and would like to learn more about what you just said, the book Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski is a brilliant book about our relationship with pleasure and the essentialness of pleasure. So I'd really encourage anybody, if they're interested, to check out Emily's book. It's a winner.
So I'm really glad you gave that reference, and we're going to talk at the end again about your book. But just one last thing, as I was sitting here imagining, we've been talking about pleasure, and it's been very enhancing and just robust. But I can imagine people saying, but what about
the asexuals?
The
whole time Ann was talking, I'm saying, don't forget the asexuals, and I was waiting to talk about it. So that's what I was thinking.
So the asexuals, but also, like, we had a recording not too long ago with someone speaking of sexual addiction, and you at the beginning had mentioned your language around that and the thinking about that. And it's really important to bring that in. So just my thought is, like, what if we do a pass on? Not where it's not pleasurable, right? Where it goes wrong from that perspective, just to loop that back in.
Yeah, I think, I'm glad you brought that, because I think what I see with people around sex addiction and moving to the idea of sex addiction is a couple of things. First of all, sex addiction became a very popular conceptualization of sexual behavior being out of control in the 80s, and it overlapped with the advent of the alcohol industry. The treatment of alcoholism and the emerging treatment industry of alcoholism became very popular and very important, and it was a very important development in addressing alcoholism in the country. But it also coincided with a second event, and that was the advent of HIV. So not only did you have this whole idea of addiction and treatment of addiction and a hope for a way of treating addiction, but we had a threat for sexual behavior unheard of on the planet. And so when you put that threat, you have to figure out, how do we understand sexual behavior that people would engage in that could have that threat and they still do it? How do we understand that? And it fit very nicely with the idea of, how does somebody love their children and still get drunk? When something is so contradictory and assaultive to our basic values, we have to figure out, how is it human beings are capable of this? And one of the ways in the 80s that we came to a conclusion that human beings do this is it's through addictive behavior.
You can't help it. So you have no control.
That's an or that we cross a threshold. An addiction is some notion of crossing a threshold into a way of functioning that we call addiction. And there's a whole understanding of how people think and feel and behave and function once they've crossed that threshold of addiction. Now, the interesting thing about addiction theory is, for many people, addiction theory means once you cross into a diagnostic or clinical entity of addiction, you can't go back. It's like the body doesn't return to never ever having to worry about addiction again. So that's why they call addiction a lifelong disease, and you have to treat it the rest of your life. Because the chronic disease, there's this idea that once you've moved into that territory, you don't get to move back home where it wasn't. And that's crucial to addiction treatment. Accepting that is essential to the success of an addiction treatment method. So when sex began to be seen as an addiction, it meant that somehow a person's sexual life can move into some range of pathology, disorder, disruption, harm, that those people now can't go back to the way other people live sexually. And if they don't monitor this successfully, they will just go back and hurt people again. And that was a very powerful narrative in the 80s that combined around alcoholism treatment and the presence of HIV. And it stuck. It was a very user-friendly idea. And I think the reason it was so user-friendly is it emphasized the fear of sex. And in our culture... And abstinence. But in our culture, more importantly, we're comfortable talking about sex when it hurts people. We really have a hard time with pleasure. So what got absent from the whole HIV conversation, let's say, was that the part of the reason people were getting infected with HIV was because safety and pleasure were in conflict. And most human beings let pleasure win out when safety and pleasure are in conflict. And we weren't addressing that around the dilemmas people were in around preventing HIV infection. How can you have really pleasurable sex and try to stay safe? And the only solution we had was a latex condom. And that wasn't very effective. So sex addiction became this way to sort of understand how people behave this way. And I don't think it's an accurate understanding of the behavior. The American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, which is the association in the United States, ASECT is its acronym, they certify the sex therapists in the United States. Now, this is really important for the listeners. A certified sex addiction therapist is not a sex therapist. I've been to many talks right here in Texas where people have said to me, well, I go see a certified sex addiction therapist. Isn't that a sex therapist? And I'm stunned. Because here's just a consumer piece of information. To become a certified sex addiction therapist in the United States, which, by the way, is certified by a private company, not an organization like ASECT, which is a nonprofit membership organization. It's done by a private company that certifies sex addiction therapists. And to be a certified sex addiction therapist requires no training in human sexuality at all. You can go through all of the training to become a certified sex addiction therapist, and they don't require you to take any courses in human sexuality.
Is that because it's so focused on the addiction concepts and the idea of treating addiction?
Yeah, and particularly the sex addiction model is a trauma-focused model. Even the Association of Sex Addiction Therapists has trauma in the name of their membership association. So it's very much a trauma lens that they see and understand sex addiction. Now, other ideas have emerged around neuropathology in the brain and a variety of other things, but there's still this basic notion that something physiologically, something psychologically, something's going on, that you've entered a state that we call addiction, and that's a disordered state. And I just don't believe that this form of human behavior is a disease or a pathology. I believe it's a problem. We have some sexual disorders. We have a lot of problems when it comes to sex. And then most of us all have sexual worries. So there's worries, problems, disorders. And I think out-of-control sexual behavior is a problem that many people with this problem also have diseases. They might have depression, they might have drug addiction, they might have bipolar disorder, they might have a personality disorder, they might have Parkinson's disease, and they're taking medications. I know it could be a variety of things. But the actual out-of-control sexual behavior in and of itself as a separate entity is a human behavior problem. And so I define out-of-control sexual behavior as when a person's sexual urges, thoughts, or behaviors feel out of control to them. So it's a subjective sense of oneself. I feel out of control with my sexual urges, thoughts, or behaviors. Now, does that mean they have a disease or a disorder or a pathology? No. But they have a conflict. They have a worry. They're distressed. We're distressed about a lot of things. That doesn't mean we have a disease or a disorder or a psychiatric condition. And so that's my distinction. I just really see it as a human behavior problem.
Would you see it, you're saying, if you feel distressed?
Right, it's a client-centered experience. The client has to feel distressed.
And so if people around the client, the partner, et cetera, are stating your behavior's out of control, you're coming home, you're having sexuality, you're out of control, but the person doesn't have distress about it. What is your feeling or thought about that?
The person is sharing their opinion with the other person.
Okay.
I have an opinion. I have an opinion. Your sexual behavior is out of control from my perspective. They may have a big conflict about that, but that doesn't mean the person's sexual behavior is out of control.
Because it may be the way that they want to relate to the world, and that level of sexuality is what works for them, and what's not working for them is that those in their life, maybe it's not matching, and that they have to figure out what their relationship to sex matches what it is their value and desire for those around you, and how that goes together.
So let me translate that from a sexual health conversation perspective. First of all, oftentimes sexual addiction or out-of-control sexual behavior emerges after a period of secrecy and deception. So they weren't being honest. So that sexual health principle was being violated for quite some time.
You mean the dialogue around it
right?
comes up.
The dialogue that comes usually from some sort of discovery,
right?
Disclosure. Somebody sees something. Somebody learns something. Suddenly, they didn't know it. They're surprised. They're shocked. They're injured. It's out there now. And so finally, there's going to be some honest conversation about what's been going on. So if they're going to move from violating that sexual health principle to not violating it, and that's tough. That's not easy to do. Then there's shared values. They may be having this honest conversation, and they're really discovering your values and my values are very different. And we're having this painful conversation, for crying out loud, that we've avoided for how long? And then the really crux of it, I think is so much why the sex addiction model is so appealing to so many people. This is what I find pleasurable. This is what you find pleasurable. And a way to resolve that painful differences around what people find pleasurable or not is to have one person's pleasure called an addiction. And so those pleasures are seen as an addictive, out of control, kind of a disordered state. And so you have to abstain from it. That's the solution to this really difficult pleasure dynamic. So I'll give an example. A couple has been in a non-sexual marriage for 10 years. They've been together 20 years, but for 10 years, a non-sexual marriage is defined as sexual intercourse less than 10 times a year. Any kind of sexual contact. That's pretty much a non-sexual relationship. And so they're in a non-sexual relationship, and one of the members of the couple is masturbating quite a lot and having solo sex and is having orgasms and pleasure. And the hypothesis is that his masturbation is a sex addiction. And if he stops masturbating, and it'll now put his sexual energy back into focusing on the coupled sex, and therefore they'll start having a robust sexual life. So he goes, this masturbation gets discovered, and he goes off to a sex addiction treatment program. And the sex addiction treatment program says to him, yes, all that masturbation is your sex addiction, so you need to stop masturbating so you can become available to your partner, and that sexual energy will go there. That's the idea. That's a sex addiction interpretation of that.
And what you're saying then, and what would your interpretation be of that?
Well, first of all, this is not sexual behavior that has to be concerned about STIs, HIV, or pregnancy. So that's off the books. This, solo sex is not bringing that to risk. It's consensual unless the person is watching children having sex with adults, or unless the person's watching images where maybe sometimes people will record people undressing in locker rooms without their consent, and people, sometimes people watch videos of things that people were in sexual situations without being known they were being filmed or cameraed. That's non-consensual. So some people have that, but that's a small exception. That's not the typical way, but they're out there. So usually solo sex is consensual and non-exploitive in the sense that, now this is where political values get in. Many people believe the production of sexual imagery cannot be anything but exploitive, that it's impossible for it to not be exploitive. Or
sexual
imagery.
What you're meaning, the listeners may know that as pornography, but in a sexual health way, you're saying sexual imagery.
It's sexual entertainment imagery. It's imagery designed to arouse and create orgasms and pleasure, or to reflect somebody's erotic interests. They look at images that look like the things that they turn them on. And so some people believe the production of these images, whether they're done commercially or amateur, cannot be anything but exploitive. Some people just take that stance. But that's a stance, not necessarily the actual circumstances of whether it's exploitive or not. So we have to kind of sift that out. So oftentimes, sexual imagery will be a values or a principle difference in couples where one person sees sexual imagery by definition as exploitive and the other person doesn't. These are big arguments.
Yeah, those are really big arguments.
And that the solution to this argument is to the sex addiction folks in particular would come down on the side that sexual imagery probably is exploitive and that you should abstain from it because it is exploitive. But I think the person themselves has to figure out when sexual imagery for them becomes exploitive in their own value systems.
Yeah, back to the case.
Yeah.
Because you had just asked, well, what would be the interpretation of the case?
Yeah. This was one of the things the couple had to deal with, was one of the persons of the couple saw sexual imagery as exploitive and objectifying, and the other person didn't.
So you have a values conflict.
They had a big values conflict, but it was honest and it was out in the open. Mm-hmm. And he had pleasure from that experience. And you know what? She finally said she did too.
So they were able to.
So when the erotic became no longer a secret, he got to know her better. He had this whole idea she would be, totally upset that he likes looking at imagery.
So he was off on his own
And
we don't have time to jump into an attachment dialogue, but I'm dying to.
He didn't know her.
Right.
He didn't know her. And it was, again, sharing who we are erotically is an amazingly powerful way to get to know people we love.
I think that's a wonderful thing. And if I can follow Sue's lead in the yes, but, what would happen in that same dialogue, that same dynamic? Well, maybe not the same, because you've really highlighted a lot of the shifts in values, and I hear what you're saying is if you.
And I'm also talking about like 4 to 5 years of a couple sitting with each other and getting to know each other.
Absolutely,
that didn't happen in a month.
And you're talking about the whole. Like the addiction model being pathologizing,
yes.
And to say, let's remove that sexually behavior and let's remove it and get you to stop that, and then there'll be sexual health, right? Like, so your model is that, and I think it's a beautiful addition to this, is like, no, let's bring that in and really get to know it more deeply and how the two people relate to it, and it took years.
Without having to identify with the disease,
without
to
having
have
to
the conversation.
So what would you say, though, if the individual, which I guess is what you are saying, if the person is distressed, what if the partner is seeing and feeling X'd out because watching, what is the term?
Sexual imagery.
Sexual imagery. Thank you. I'm going to practice that.
Yeah,
practice
good.
that.
See, I love it when people have sexual health conversations and then they want to change their language.
I'm changing my language.
I love that. Good
so
for
we're
you.
watching sexual imagery, but ends up doing it somewhat compulsively. As a psychologist, there is compulsivity.
Yes,
right. So
right.
So if we're moving away from the addiction, you're moving away from the addiction model. But we're seeing things, and there's a compulsive connection between sexual imagery and masturbation that becomes, in some ways, siloed off, right? And that can happen where that the individual finds more pleasure through sexual imagery and compulsive that kind of precludes the ability to be relational with that. What would you say about that?
Well, you've linked a lot of things and made assumptions along the way that I
have
have no idea if they're true.
That's true.
I mean, it's a lovely story, but I don't know if it fits the client.
Right.
We have to get to know the client. So the way I work with out-of-control sexual behavior, it's a very assessment upfront activity. So we look at if there's mental illness, is there a relationship with drugs and alcohol that's problematic? Is there physical illnesses or medical conditions that haven't been identified? Are they physically safe in the home? Is there domestic violence? Is there suicide? Is there other kind of issues around lack of safety in the home? That has to be looked at before we even do anything else. Because those can all be factors that create dysregulated sexual behavior.
Right. So I guess we're going to have to start wrapping, but I guess what I'm saying is like, and we have been, which I love, sex health, sex positive, and bringing things in, but we are also adding that there are things that can be, I'm going to ask you to find the word, because now all I can hear is, but maybe compulsive, or what you're saying is...
Here's how I would say it.
Or if you're violating these principles.
There's where I'm going to go.
Thank you.
There's sexual behavior that you're calling compulsive, but I'm going to say violates one or more of the sexual health principles.
Okay. Say more.
And that when somebody is maybe secretively masturbating at a high frequency, or having sex with somebody outside of their relationship agreement, or somebody's, whatever they're doing, they're violating one or more of those sexual health principles quite frequently in order to engage in that activity. So my model says, this, you don't have a disease. You need to align your life with 6 principles of sexual health. If you start aligning your sexual life with these 6 principles, you won't have out-of-control sexual behavior. They're mutually exclusive.
So I think that is a really great kind of summary. And so part of it is we're going to, on our show notes, really outline these 6 principles again. And you had said that maybe there would be a paper, or do you have anything?
I do have a couple of things. What I'm going to probably link people to is my website, which has a lot of resources.
Which is what?
The Harvey Institute.com. The company we have is the Harvey Institute, where our mission is to educate health professionals to have sexual health conversations. We believe healthcare in America will improve if the doctor, the nurse, the therapist, the OBGYN you go to is capable of having a sexual health conversation with you. Your sexual health will improve.
And you have made so many remarkable national strides at changing this conversation.
Let me just tell you a couple. California law just changed in June, where now all foster youth in every county of the state of California is required to attend both comprehensive sex education classes. The social worker has to make sure the youth attended both the junior high and high school comprehensive sex education. Secondly, all the social workers, all the foster parents, all the judges, all the attorneys, everybody who comes in contact as a professional with the foster youth has to be trained how to have a sexual health conversation. It's law in the state of California, and it's a fully funded law. And this came out of our intervention we did with LA County. So we're very excited that an intervention we started in LA County has now become the law of the state of California.
That's fantastic.
I think the thing why I'm so passionate about doing podcasts like this, I really believe sexual health conversations matter. And you never know the ripple effects of these conversations. Mm-hmm. We'll never know what somebody might do with a sentence one of us said here, how it might help them, how it might make them more curious, how it might make them more open, it might make them more interested in something. And
less shaming with their child, which could have a lifelong ripple effect.
Less shaming and more interested.
And more curious, more interested, right. So I'm very committed to these kinds of conversations with people like you who are so generous with creating forums for the public to, have these sort of, conversations with people they would maybe normally never get a chance to meet, like me or something.
Yeah, exactly.
So I just thank you for that, and I think none of us are going to know what the outcome of our conversation's been.
Though we would love to hear from our listeners what outcome that you did have that you're aware of.
Yeah, what were you dying to say to Doug, or any follow-ups or anything like that? Feel free to just let us know. And
the book is called Treating Out of Control Sexual Behavior, Rethinking Sex Addiction. And so it's really the sexual health model for looking at out-of-control sexual behavior. Many of the things we did talk about here at the end are in the book. Now, the book is for professionals or anybody who's treating or providing services for people with out-of-control sexual behavior who wants to be better informed. We are in the process right now of writing a companion book for the public on how they can have their own guide on how to use these approaches without necessarily having to go to a therapist, or a therapist can read Treating Out of Control, Rethinking Sex Addiction, and their client could be reading the book we're writing. And they could just sit together and work through this.
That's awesome. One of the things that we have found with our listeners is that a whole lot of them that aren't therapists they're very smart and interested, and they might grab it up anyway because
I think they could find it helpful.
Yes, it's actually, there's a hungry world out there to learn and to grow, so they might not even wait for it. But in case you would like to, there's another one coming for sure.
That's right.
So stay tuned to that.
Doug, I really appreciate you being on this podcast. I think you've opened my eyes to a lot of things. I'm hearing my language grow from it. And the reason we wanted you on here was for the exact reason you just said, to increase a dialogue out there in a way that adds to the richness of more positivity in this context. So I think you've really, really brought our listeners a vast amount of knowledge. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a joy.
Absolutely. And when you say, you never know what the impact is, I can tell you from my awareness of your work, even many, many years ago, I can remember literally leaving with a different mindset and sort of a shift and being open. And then all the people that I've seen since then have been touched by that. So it really is an incredibly wonderful ripple effect of opening us from our own, where we don't even know, we don't even know that we're clamping down on something. So it's really refreshing.
And we would love to hear from listeners out there. Get on our website at www.therapistuncensored.com. And there's a portion there. You're welcome to give us feedback. There's an Ask a Therapist. So if you have a question for Doug, I'm sure you'd be willing to maybe take it on and inform us, and we can get back to them ourselves.
Right. Get in touch with me. If the listener calls you, you get in touch with me, and I'd be glad to chat with you and have you have the conversation with your listener.
Sounds exciting.
That sounds great. And for those of you that are tracking and that are on our waiting list for our online course, it's happening. We haven't forgotten about it. It is getting better and better, so stay tuned. And last thing, we want to ask you all, if you enjoyed this podcast and if you're still hanging around hearing this, then we really, what you could do to help us and to give us fuel for our fire here and keep us going and bringing on guests like this is to go to your podcast player and rate us. If you'll give us an honest rating, it makes a really, really big difference on a cascade of things. So our request for today would be to go and give us a rating. And in the meantime, we will see you around the bend. We've got lots in store, and hang tight.
Therapist Uncensored is Ann Kelley and Sue Marriott. This podcast is edited by Jack Anderson.